Good afternoon or good morning. This is lesson 3.1, Washington's Precedents, posted January 10th. The standard and do now can be seen on your screen. Please pause here a moment and complete your do now. This is lesson 3.1, which is the first lesson of the Unit 3 in New Nation, which covers the years 1787 to 1825. In this unit, you will be taking the time to understand how the early American Republic faced severe challenges early on in its time, how the emergence of political parties and their debates over key issues emerged. You'll be able to discuss the causes of the impacts of the War of 1812, and you'll be able to explain how technological developments changed American society. As you go through this, there will be some changes to the way that we'll be running class. There will be printed handouts with fill in the blanks. Additional notes you want to take can be put on the side or on the back where there is space. You'll receive a study guide at the start of the unit. Vocabulary quizzes will act as formative assessments, and there will be museum displays as participation in knowledge checks throughout the unit. Our key questions is how effectively did the federal government respond to domestic and foreign challenges? How did the War of 1812 shape national identity? Our key vocabulary and concepts will be what you can see here on the board. Please take a moment to pause here and look through these. You do not need to write any of these down. They will be in your notes, but keep in mind that this is what we will be looking at as we go through the unit. Our first lesson today focuses on President George Washington, the first president of the United States, seen here pictured at his inauguration where he's being sworn in 1787 as the first president of the United States. After the signing of the Constitution, Americans selected George Washington as their first president. He would set many precedents that other presidents would choose to follow. In your notes, record the definition of precedents, that is, an action that is seen as an example to follow. When somebody sets a precedent, you are saying that this is the way that one person should act, that it's a good way to act. For instance, a precedent I set is I always try to start every class off with good morning because those are an example of a polite way to start interacting with another person. So it's an action that you do because you specifically want it to be seen as an example to follow. He set quite a few precedents as president. George Washington set the idea that we should have two terms for presidents, 4 years each, and then retire. He believed in the peaceful transition of power. He chose not to campaign in the election of his successor, the person who came after him, and he instead encouraged everyone to support the new president after him. In his cabinet, he selected advisors to run the different departments. These advisors would run the departments and report back to him at cabinet meetings, and he would direct what he'd like to see each cabinet do in those cabinet meetings. He believed in a strict and loose interpretation of the constitutional role. That means where the Constitution was very clear, he followed it. He expanded the power of the president where it wasn't. I want you to pause here and think. You don't need to share your answer yet. We're going to share it when we come back together. I want you to give an example of a president following or ignoring one of these precedents. When you get to this point, please raise your hand and make sure that you have all of this in your notes. So, after we've had our discussion, hopefully we had said some examples like this. For instance, when it comes to terms, here's some examples of those who did and did not follow the example. On the right, you see President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He served for four terms. He was limited by his death. He died in his fourth term. In the middle, you can see I believe his great uncle. I'm not actually quite sure their relation, or they're maybe distant cousins, but Teddy Roosevelt, he ran for a third term, but he lost his election. And Barack Obama, who only ran for two terms, and he was stopped because of the 22nd Amendment, which is a part of our Constitution that says presidents can now only run for two terms. Well, why was that 22nd Amendment made? Because of this guy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt broke with precedent by running for additional terms, and that upset people, leading to the creation of the 22nd Amendment, so that we would continue to have the tradition now as part of law that you have to only serve 2 years or 2 terms for 4 years each. A peaceful transition of power. I have two examples here. Um, where the president chooses not to campaign the election of a successor and encouraged everyone to support the new president after him. Here you can see on the left in the 2000 election, Vice President Al Gore ran against Texas Governor George W. Bush. In their election, it came down to a tie. The state of Florida was the tiebreaker. People didn't know which way it was going. The votes were not being counted in a way that was making people very happy. It became very controversial. It ended up going to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled that George W. Bush was the winner. Vice President Al Gore could have blocked the transition of power. He could have fought against it, but instead he chose to support the new elected president and say that he and his supporters should support George W. Bush, thus leading to a peaceful transition. On the other side, you can see a not so peaceful transition, the 2020 election. After the election of Joseph Biden as president, President Trump felt that he had his election stolen from him. And so instead of saying, I am choosing to listen to what the law is saying about the fact that I have not won the election, he instead encouraged his supporters to fight against this, starting a movement called Stop the Steal, which would eventually lead to the January 6th attack on the Capitol, is a very good example of a not very peaceful transition of power. The cabinet here, you can see two cabinets on the right. You can see George W. Bush's original cabinet, just four members of his cabinet, making up the four major departments he had: Treasury, State Treasury, Vice President, and War. As you can see, the five of them right there. On the left-hand side, you can see our 46th president, our current one, with his vice president and his many members of the cabinet. As you can see, there's approximately, I'm counting them real quick. It looks like there's almost 27 members of the cabinet. The federal government, this really is a great way to see how much the federal government has grown in both size and power since the times of George Washington. Last but not least, strict and loose interpretation. There are certain things that presidents can and cannot do. On the left-hand side, you can see how President Roosevelt expanded his power to actively get legislation that would make things like the USA Work Program, the WPA, in a lot of ways to help fight the Great Depression. He knew that he wasn't really like it wasn't part of his job to specifically um, grow the size of the government and provide jobs to people and help fight the depression, but he chose to do it anyway because he saw it as a kind of a loose area where he could expand his job, and that was ruled constitutional. Um, on the right hand side, President Truman ruled that the U.S. could take over steel mills because the steel workers were on strike. Um, this was something that was ruled unconstitutional. The president doesn't have the right to take over steel mills just because it's in the nation's interest to have steel. So there are elements of how still both sides of George Washington's precedents are being followed today. Now, the president is said to wear many hats because of the many different jobs that he has or they have, hopefully with a she someday. And these different hats represent the different jobs that go into being president. They've been set by both George Washington and other presidents over time. So these seven hats are: one, chief of state, to inspire and represent the U.S., the chief executive, he is the boss of all the executive branches, the chief diplomat, it is his job to work with foreign leaders from other countries. He's commander in chief, which means he is in charge of our entire military. He's the legislative leader, which means he encourages laws being made by working with Congress. He is the chief of party, meaning he is the lead Republican or Democrat of the party that he is from. And he's the chief citizen. He's supposed to represent and advocate for the people, be a national role model for how to act. Together, these seven different parts of the president's job work together to make the president one of the most powerful people on the planet and most definitely one of the most powerful people in our country. Um, and so today, you're going to take some time to discuss with your groups the hats of the president. And as you look at these hats, I want you to think to yourself, what is the most important job that they have? What is the least important job they have? As you work on this assignment, you're going to take some time to read through the hats again and then write down why, in a two-seek format, you believe one of the jobs is more important than the rest. When you're done, some groups have extended questions, some don't. Please let me know which group you're in so that I can get you the right handouts. So, if you have any questions, come see me in real life.